1, 2, 3.
There's more film movements, believe it or not, and today we'll be talking about 5 from the 70s. Check them out, they're good for you. First, Australian New Wave. This is the first mention of this continent, I believe, in the series. Australia did have a film industry prior to this point. When I was looking back at some historical stuff for Australia, I didn't see very much that I recognized, but it was there. I will say 2 people of note. Errol Flynn started out in Australia, in Tasmania specifically, and he went on to be a notable Hollywood star. He is awesome in Captain Blood. I would recommend that movie. As a side note, not Australian, but whatever. And then also George Lazenby, notably Australian, would go on to become one of the Bonds. I don't remember if he was well liked as a Bond. I want to say his tenure was short. But anyway, jumping to the 70s. Or actually, you know what? First, let's jump to the 60s, where cinema was in decline in Australia. And the government stepped in, 2 successive governments from 1968 to 1975, to help rejuvenate the industry. And as a result, they helped create the Australian New Wave, in which a whole bunch of directors stepped forward, made notable, well-regarded works. This movement is not a monolith. It is not one tight stylistic vision, but there are a couple of general overarching ideas that can be found in a lot of works. And they are, 1, Australia as a sort of character, as a unforgiving landscape in a certain way. The most notable example of this, and my favorite Australian film, is Wake and Fright, where the sort of desolation and the sparseness of the landscape and the area in which this schoolteacher moves to pairs well with this thematic idea of man's brutishness, the almost futility of civilization, that brutishness is always lurking beneath the surface. Love this movie, despite the real animal deaths, unfortunately, but would recommend this one a lot. And then the second main idea that can be found is an examination, sometimes celebration, sometimes critique, of Australia's history and artistic tradition. The critique can be found in films like The Chant of Jimmie, Blacksmith, which examines Australia and the treatment of Indigenous peoples. And sometimes there can be a celebration of Australian arts, like My Brilliant Career, which is a literary adaptation. So this movement is not, like I said, a tight stylistic vision. And this is kind of in contrast to some of the stuff we've seen before with movements like poetic realism or surrealism or things like that. It's more a reinvention of a country's history on the fly, responding to changing times, changing demands. And this is something that we will see again later in this video with New Hollywood. So just a slightly different kind of movement, but still a movement nonetheless, as it overturned quite a bit for the country. Some notable directors who came out of this movement include Peter Weir, Gillian Armstrong, Phil Noyce, George Miller, and Bruce Beresford. There were also some notable actors coming out at this point, such as Sam Neill, Mel Gibson, and Nicole Kidman. Some notable films, besides the ones I previously mentioned, include Walkabout, The Cars That Ate Paris, and Picnic at Hanging Rock. Next, we will talk New German cinema. New German cinema did start in the 60s, but I'll just include it here because the 60s video is too long, and a lot of the work happened in the 70s. Germany has made an appearance on this series before with German Expressionism back in the 20s, but of course in intervening years they had to deal with world wars and a whole bunch of upheaval in general with the East-West Germany split. So we'll just jump ahead to the 50s and 60s where cinema attendance was suffering, partially due to some economic upturn actually, and people were able to afford other activities than going to the cinema, as well as personal TV sets making it easier to not go to the cinema, basically. Just more excuses to not watch movies. In light of this perceived stagnation, some filmmakers cooperated to pen the Oberhausen Manifesto on February 28, 1962, and that declared an allegiance to new cinema. Some notable filmmakers allied with the manifesto include Rainer Werner Fassbinder, Werner Herzog, and Wim Wenders. Initially, the films had to use a minimal budget due to not much profitability, although eventually the government did help to subsidize a good amount of these films, which continued to not be profitable nationally, but did receive a lot of art house international attention, and many of these works and directors are still well regarded internationally. Fassbinder may be the most notable for the period. He had a fascinating combination of relationships and social fluidity. That's probably not the right way to put it, but whatever. Watch his stuff, you'll see what I mean. Fassbinder, as a side note, had a sort of fascinating life. Not the most savory character, well known for being very controversial, potentially a domestic abuser in at least one relationship. Had actually multiple former partners pass away at their own hands. Frequently cast current partners in roles with him. For instance, Ali in Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, which happens to be one of the most well-regarded works of the movement. Ali, the character, the actor, was at the time a partner of his, and also one of the ones who would go on to, themselves. Side note, I just thought that was interesting, something I read up on. You can read more about him if you would like. Interesting character, well-regarded director with a lot of interesting output. Did also die young due to a overdose. But beyond him, two others, the two other notable directors I mentioned with the manifesto. Werner Herzog, still working, I believe. And he has transitioned from making some spectacular films like Fitzcarraldo and Aguierre, both of which are kind of famous/infamous for their scope for some of these stories surrounding the story itself, the real life stories. And he has gone on to direct a lot of interesting documentary work, perhaps most notably Grizzly Man. And then Wim Wenders, also a long career, still working, just made Perfect Days last year, which I enjoyed a lot. I haven't seen some of his most well-known output, like Wings of Desire or Paris, Texas, but I definitely will at some point. He has a lot of expertise in depicting sort of uniquely empathetic situations, I would say. For something that's closer to this era, I have seen The American Friend, featuring Dennis Hopper, strangely enough, which I think is a film that's well worth digging into. So those are three of the main directors from the time. Again, this is again a bit of an art house movement. So this stuff did not gain a lot of national attention until some international recognition. And then they were able to get support from their country. But some well-known directors from here, some famous works, like I said, Aguierre, Fitzcarraldo, Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, Paris, Texas, all good stuff. Next, we will talk about the LA Rebellion. This describes a collection of black filmmakers studying at the UCLA Film School in the late 60s. Again, technically not all 70s, but whatever. Started late 60s. We'll call it the 70s because a lot of the most famous stuff was in the 70s. Black students had graduated from the film school as early as 1953, but affirmative action had started to bring up those numbers a little bit through the 60s, and some of these filmmakers took more influence from European, from African cinema, and they often created striking, ground-level depictions of the black experience in America. Charles Burnett may be the most well-regarded director from the movement. Scorsese actually cited Burnett as one of the finest filmmakers in the country, and he is well known for Killer of Sheep and To Sleep with Anger, primarily. My personal favorite that I've seen from the movement is Bless Their Little Hearts. This has a fantastic score by Archie Shepp and Esther Phillips, so this beautiful melancholic jazz feel. It's about a black father who has this struggle between his past and upbringing, his present with his family, trying to lead them well while also looking for work and trying to just reconcile all these factors of his life together. And it features, I know this is a weird selling point, but it also features one of the best marital fight scenes, if not the best I've ever seen in a movie. Highly recommend. And if I remember right, Charles Burnett actually worked on this film in some capacity. I want to say he was a cinematographer, writer, and cinematographer. So yes, get a little Charles Burnett exposure through Bless Their Little Hearts. Recommend that as well. Love that movie. And then last, I know I said there were 5 movements in this video. There are actually 4. My bad. New Hollywood. New Hollywood is for sure the most visible movement of these 4. As I go through this, you'll recognize, there's more directors than I could possibly highlight in this movement. The 50s and 60s, actually much like Australia, there was sort of a demographic crisis with US filmmaking. Studios started to realize that the demographics were different and younger, college educated, and more interested in even European cinema at times. So it prompted some experimentation, starting with films like Bonnie and Clyde, for example. That was an early one that sparked some controversy, some divisiveness among critics, and it worked. Audiences loved it. And studios started to realize maybe we should give some projects over to people who can identify with these sorts of demands that audiences have now. And that's exactly what happened. A ton of money went into it, and a ton of directors and extremely well-regarded works came out of it. Many films had some amount of experimentation with narrative and style. It's Again, there's so many directors and so many works here that it's hard to identify a specific thread. But this is just like American cinema and Hollywood turning over a new leaf, giving over to the new direction in which things were going. And you can kind of see other previous movements building up into this movement because a lot of these directors were educated in film schools and they were raised up on things like French New Wave, which themselves preached experimentation and breaking of traditional norms. And this movement, you could argue, is the biggest break from tradition, the sort of like final cord being severed of tradition of a previous generation of filmmaking. And like I said earlier, there's just so many directors and films. If there's a big American film you recognize from the 70s, there's a pretty good chance it was a new Hollywood director. You have directors like Francis Ford Coppola, Steven Spielberg, Brian De Palma, William Friedkin, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas. You know, just from those guys, you have films like the Godfather movies, Jaws, French Connection, Taxi Driver, American Graffiti, eventually Star Wars as well from Lucas. You can include other directors who maybe didn't have the same level of box office success, but are still highly regarded to this day. Directors like Robert Altman, Terrence Malick, John Cassavetes, perhaps. Too many good movies, too many good moments to point out. But the takeaway is this is like the big push towards the modern direction of cinema that we really still see today. Because so many of these directors are actually still working, many of them still alive. And the direction in which we went from old Hollywood to new Hollywood, this is the new direction of film. When an entity as big as Hollywood takes such a modern step, you know it's going to bring up any stragglers left behind because, you know, no one wants to be the last person stuck doing the old thing. And this is a huge change globally. Obviously, like I've said, there are other countries that were doing similar things, modernizing, rejecting old Hollywood, for instance, like we just talked about New German cinema. The verbiage in that manifesto was talking about leaving old cinema behind. The 70s is kind of an era of reinvention, finally leaving the last vestiges of the old behind. And I think that's summed up well in New Hollywood. So those are the movements for this week. And at some point, I'll make the film on the 80s. So I'll see you then.